The dim office lights flickered above me, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words as I sat across from my boss, the person who had once been a mentor, a friend, and the very foundation of my career. I could feel the tension, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm. I had seen this moment coming for months, maybe even years. Every conversation, every subtle shift in their attitude, had been a clue. But no one else seemed to notice. No one else knew what was about to happen. John, my boss, finally spoke, his voice betraying no emotion, but I could hear the finality in his words. "We're letting you go. Effective immediately." The words hit me like a slap, and yet, they didn't surprise me. I had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it in a way that only someone who had been in the trenches for as long as I had could. 15 years. 15 years of dedication, sacrifice, and loyalty, only to be dismissed with a few cold words. I had seen it before, the subtle power games, the changing priorities, the way I was slowly edged out of the decisions that mattered. But there was something more in the air today. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a betrayal. I glanced at the door, my hand unconsciously balling into a fist. This wasn't just about the job. It was about everything I had put into this company, everything I had worked for, only to be tossed aside as if I meant nothing. They didn't know what was coming, and they wouldn't understand until it was too late. This was just the beginning. There were things I knew about them, things they didn't want anyone to know, and it was time for the truth to come out. I had been pushed to the edge, and now I was ready to strike back. It was too late to turn back now. The game had changed, and they had no idea what they were about to unleash. I stared at the polished surface of the desk, trying to gather my thoughts. The coldness of the room mirrored the ice settling in my chest. I had worked with Thomas for over a decade. He had once been like a brother to me. But things had shifted long ago, and I had been too blind, too trusting, to realize just how much. As a young man fresh out of college, I had entered this company full of ambition, eager to prove myself. The office was a jungle back then, but it had been my jungle. Thomas had been a guiding force, a mentor who helped me navigate the complex world of corporate politics. His advice had always seemed calculated, precise, yet I had taken it at face value, believing he genuinely wanted what was best for me. I had admired him, perhaps even idolized him. Over time, though, the admiration began to fade. It wasn't that Thomas had suddenly changed. It was that I had started seeing the cracks in the system, the undercurrents of manipulation that I had once overlooked. As I climbed the corporate ladder, I began to notice how Thomas had this uncanny ability to make people feel small, to twist their words, to turn them against each other for his own gain. The office was no longer a place of collaboration but a battleground, with Thomas as the undisputed king, at least, that's how it seemed from the outside. But I had known better. Deep down, I had always sensed something darker beneath the surface. I had witnessed him pull strings from the shadows, orchestrating betrayals in the name of corporate success. The more I advanced, the more I became entangled in his web. I thought I could play the game better than anyone, and for a time, I did. But soon, I became a pawn just like everyone else. The only difference was that I had spent 15 years mastering the art of reading people, learning their weaknesses, understanding their fears. And that's when I started to see the cracks in his facade. I remember the first time it happened, the first time I realized that Thomas was no longer my ally. It was a quiet moment, one that seemed insignificant at the time, but it would mark the beginning of everything unraveling. We were in a meeting with the board of directors, discussing a new project that could make or break the company. Thomas had always been the charismatic leader, the one who spoke with authority, who got people on his side without them even realizing it. But this time, I spoke up. I had noticed a flaw in his proposal, a small one, but significant enough to cause potential problems down the line. I didn't hesitate. I pointed it out in the meeting, knowing the risks but feeling it was necessary. The room fell silent. I saw a flicker of irritation flash across Thomas's face, but he quickly masked it with a smile. He tried to brush it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I could feel the eyes of the room shift from him to me. For the first time in years, I had felt like I was on equal footing with him. That was the moment everything changed. Thomas didn't take kindly to being challenged, not by anyone, and certainly not by me. I had been his right hand for so long, and now, for the first time, I was questioning him. It wasn't just the company anymore. It was him, too. And that shift in power, no matter how small, had set off a chain reaction that I couldn't have predicted. The next few weeks were a blur. Thomas started pulling away from me, no longer offering the guidance he once had. Our conversations became more terse, more transactional. He stopped involving me in key decisions, and when I did manage to secure a seat at the table, I noticed a subtle change in how the others treated me. There was a sense of distance, a coldness that hadn't been there before. It was as if Thomas had whispered to them that I was no longer to be trusted. I didn't know if he was actively plotting my downfall or if it was just his way of keeping his dominance intact, but one thing was clear: he was distancing himself from me. I tried to maintain the relationships I had built over the years, but it was like walking on eggshells. My colleagues, once friends, now treated me with suspicion. The jokes we used to share around the water cooler had become strained. Even my closest allies, people who had been with me through the toughest projects, were pulling away. I could feel the walls closing in on me. Then, there was Sandra. She had always been a quiet presence in the office, but over the years, I had grown to trust her more than anyone. She was sharp, resourceful, and always had a sense of calm in the chaos. She had seen the changes in Thomas, just like I had, and had been more vocal about it than I was. She had warned me that the man I had once admired was no longer the same. "I've been watching him for years, John," she'd said one afternoon, after a particularly heated board meeting. "Thomas isn't the person you think he is. He plays this game with everyone, and when he's done with you, you'll be discarded like everyone else." At the time, I had dismissed it as paranoia. Sandra was always a bit more cynical than the rest of us, but as the months went on, I couldn't ignore the truth in her words. She was right. Thomas had been playing a long game, and I had been so focused on my own rise that I had failed to see the bigger picture. But it wasn't just Thomas the first had to worry about. It was the entire system, the corporate machinery that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. I had been part of it for so long that I had come to believe in its power, in its ability to dictate everything. But now, I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my downfall wasn't just about Thomas. It was about the way I had let myself get consumed by this world, the way I had put my loyalty and trust into a system that ultimately cared for no one. I had invested too much of myself into the company, and now, as they dismissed me with nothing but a cold, final statement, I was left with nothing but the realization that I had been blind all along. But I wasn't going to let it end like this. I wasn't going to let Thomas and the rest of them think they had won. The game was far from over. And for the first time in years, I was ready to play it on my own terms. The cold wind outside hit me as I stepped out of the office building for the last time. My mind raced, the weight of the dismissal still sinking in. 15 years. 15 years of hard work, of sacrifices, of putting everything I had into this company. And just like that, it was over. The world had changed in an instant, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to let go. Something inside me stirred, a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. They thought they could dismiss me, erase everything I had built, but they were wrong. They had no idea what I had learned, what I had gathered along the way. The next few days were a blur. I spent my time in a daze, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Friends I thought I had trusted, people I had worked side by side with for years, now avoided me. Their texts were cold, their phone calls infrequent, as if the moment I was no longer valuable to them, I ceased to exist. I didn't blame them. I had known how this world worked long before my departure. But it didn't make it any easier. Sandra's words echoed in my mind constantly. "He's playing a game, John. When he's done with you, he'll discard you. He's always one step ahead." I had thought she was being paranoid, but now I realized the truth in her warning. Thomas was playing chess while the rest of us were stuck on checkers. The problem was, I wasn't the only one who had been discarded. In the wake of my firing, others began to step forward, whispering about their own experiences. I wasn't the first person Thomas had crushed, and I wouldn't be the last. I was no longer a part of the company, but I wasn't blind to what was happening. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. Thomas was a master of manipulation, but his influence wasn't as invulnerable as he thought. I began speaking to former colleagues, people who had left before me, and I started piecing together the full scope of his control over the company. What I had once thought was corporate ambition now seemed more like a carefully executed game of power. Thomas wasn't just trying to run a business, he was trying to create a legacy, and everyone around him was just a pawn in his quest to reach the top. Then came the moment that would change everything. I had been keeping my distance from Sandra, unsure if I could trust anyone anymore. But after a long night of thinking, I finally reached out to her. I needed to know if she had seen what I had seen. It was time to talk, to stop hiding from the truth. "John, it's good to hear from you." Sandra's voice was soft over the phone, but there was a note of tension in it. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." "I've been thinking about a lot of things," I said, my voice low. "About Thomas, about everything we've been through. And I don't think I can walk away from this. I need to know what you know. I need to understand exactly what's been going on." There was a long pause before Sandra spoke again, her words careful. "You're not the only one he's hurt, John. You weren't the first, and you won't be the last. But I'm telling you this for your own good. The more you dig, the deeper you get, the harder it'll be to come back from it." Her warning was a gut punch, but it also stoked the fire inside me. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't just let it all go. I had been betrayed, discarded, and now I was ready to expose the truth. What if we expose him? What if we take him down? Sandra hesitated, then sighed deeply. "I've thought about it. I've tried to figure out a way, but it's not that simple. Thomas is untouchable. The higher-ups protect him, the board respects him. And you know how this world works, people like him always get away with it. I wasn't going to let that stop me. I know how it works, Sandra. But I've got something he doesn't. I've been watching him, learning from him for years. I've got a plan." And just like that, I felt the shift. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was taking control. It wasn't enough to play by the rules of the game. It was time to break them. The plan began to form in my mind like a puzzle, each piece clicking into place. Thomas had a lot of power, but he had a weakness, too. He had built his empire on lies, manipulations, and hidden secrets. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that everyone had a secret. And if you knew where to look, you could always find the cracks in their armor. I had to get close again. It wasn't enough to sit on the sidelines and watch Thomas continue to operate unchallenged. If I wanted to take him down, I needed to get back inside the game. I needed to make him trust me again, even if it was only for a moment. I started making calls. Subtle, quiet calls to people still inside the company, those who were too scared to speak up or too loyal to Thomas to confront him directly. I knew the risks, but it didn't matter anymore. The more I spoke to people, the more I realized that many of them felt just as I did, trapped, powerless, and desperate for a way out. It was time to unite them, to get them to see that there was a way to fight back, a way to expose Thomas for what he truly was. But not everyone was willing to join the cause. Some were too afraid. Some had families to protect, mortgages to pay, and reputations to maintain. I couldn't blame them. The game Thomas played was ruthless, and those who got in his way were often burned without a second thought. But a few, a small handful, agreed to help. We began meeting in secret, carefully planning our next moves. We knew that if we moved too quickly or too aggressively, it would all fall apart. But if we were patient, if we waited for the right moment, we could expose him for good. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the toxic, corrupt system that had taken so many of us down. Thomas wasn't the only problem. He was a symptom of a much larger issue, one that stretched beyond the walls of the company and into the very fabric of the industry itself. But as we grew more confident, I began to sense something darker, something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Thomas was no fool. He knew what I was doing, and he wasn't going to let me take him down without a fight. Every time I got too close to the truth, it seemed like something, or someone, was standing in my way. I didn't know who it was at first, but I was starting to suspect that Thomas wasn't the only one pulling strings. Someone else was watching me, tracking my every move, and they weren't going to stop until I was silenced for good. The closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. It was no longer just a fight for my career, or even for justice. It was a fight for survival. The day it all came to a head, I was ready. Or at least, I told myself I was. The plan was in motion, the pieces carefully aligned. We had everything we needed to expose Thomas, the evidence, the witnesses, the hidden connections that linked him to every shady deal and underhanded maneuver that had been buried over the years. I had spent weeks preparing, and I thought I knew every angle, every risk. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. The meeting was set. The boardroom was large, filled with polished tables and chairs that had hosted countless negotiations, deals, and decisions. Today, it would host the final act of a long-brewing war. The air in the room was thick with tension, but I could feel the calm within me. It wasn't just that I was about to expose Thomas. It was that I finally understood what I had been fighting for all along. It wasn't just my career. It was the lives of everyone who had been destroyed by his manipulation. As I stepped into the room, my heart raced. The members of the board were seated around the table, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Thomas was at the head, as always, his steely gaze fixed on me. He didn't know what was coming. But I did. "John," Thomas said, his voice smooth and measured. "I'm glad you could join us. We have a lot to discuss." I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was one of quiet resolve. "Yes, Thomas. We do." The room was silent, the weight of what was about to happen hanging in the air. I could see the subtle shift in Thomas's posture, his usual confidence wavering, just for a moment. But he quickly masked it, leaning forward in his chair, fingers steepled together in a familiar gesture. He was used to controlling the room, used to being in charge. And yet, he didn't realize that the tables had already turned. I pulled out the folder from my briefcase, the folder that held the key to everything. The emails, the records, the testimonies from those who had been brave enough to speak out. I placed it on the table in front of me, the sound of the folder hitting the surface sharp and deliberate. "You might want to take a look at this," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos that was building inside me. Thomas's eyes flickered to the folder, his expression unreadable, but I could tell something in him shifted. He didn't know what was inside. He didn't know what I had uncovered. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice suddenly cold, his usual charm replaced with something darker. "You don't know what you're dealing with." I met his gaze head-on. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Thomas. I've been dealing with it for years. It's time everyone else saw it too." I slid the folder across the table, letting the content spill out before the eyes of the board. The room was silent as they began to look through the papers, the shock and disbelief spreading across their faces. I had expected some resistance, some attempts to cover things up, but what happened next took me by surprise. As the board members processed the evidence, a subtle shift occurred. One by one, they began to look at Thomas differently. The facade was cracking. They had always known there was something off, something wrong, but none of them had been brave enough to confront it. Until now. Thomas's jaw clenched. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back with a loud scrape against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice filled with anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, John. You don't know what you've just unleashed." I stood as well, my posture unshaken. "You're right about one thing, Thomas. I don't know exactly what I've unleashed. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. You've been pulling the strings for too long. It ends today." The room was tense, everyone watching, unsure of what would happen next. But Thomas wasn't done. His eyes flicked around the room, assessing the reactions of the board members. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the quick mental math he was doing, weighing his options. Then, without warning, he turned to one of the board members. "You've been in on this too, haven't you?" Thomas said, his voice a venomous whisper, just loud enough for the rest of us to hear. "You knew about the deals, about everything." The accusation landed with a heavy thud, and the man he addressed, Gerald, a quiet member of the board, flinched, his face paling. For a moment, there was a deafening silence. Everyone was waiting for him to respond, to deny it, to defend himself. But Gerald didn't. I didn't know it was this bad, Gerald stammered, his voice shaky. I didn't realize. I thought it was all just business as usual. Thomas's expression twisted into something dark, something almost primal. Business as usual. You think this is just business as usual? But before Thomas could escalate the situation further, I stepped forward, my voice steady. This isn't just business, Thomas. This is about people. People you've destroyed. People you've used as stepping stones to climb higher. And now, you're going to face the consequences. The room was electric with the tension of the moment, every eye in the room locked onto Thomas. He was unraveling, his usual calm replaced by a volatile mix of rage and panic. But in that moment, I knew. I had won. It wasn't just about the evidence anymore. It was about the truth finally coming to light. Thomas stood frozen for a moment longer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The room fell into stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The board members sat still for a few moments, processing what they had just witnessed. Then, one by one, they began to speak. "We need to reevaluate everything," one of them said, his voice wavering slightly. "This can't go unpunished." Another spoke up, a woman who had been silent until now. "I had my suspicions, but this is more than I ever thought possible." And with that, the floodgates opened. The truth was out. Thomas's reign of manipulation and deceit had finally been exposed. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone he had ever wronged. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had just unfolded, a strange sense of emptiness washed over me. I had won, yes. But at what cost? The battle had been long, and though the war was over, I knew there was no true victory without sacrifice. The game had changed, and in the end, we all had to live with the consequences. But as I walked out of that room, leaving the wreckage of Thomas's empire behind me, I knew one thing for certain: I was free. The days following the exposure of Thomas were a whirlwind. The company was in turmoil, its foundations shaking as the reality of his actions spread like wildfire. The board had no choice but to take swift action. An emergency meeting was called, and within hours, a plan was put into motion to remove Thomas from his position. His resignation, or rather, his forced departure, was a spectacle. The man who had once commanded every room with his charisma and sharpness was now a ghost, scrambling to save face as his empire crumbled around him. The press picked up the story quickly, and within days, the news was everywhere. Thomas Hart, the once celebrated CEO, exposed as the mastermind behind years of corporate corruption, manipulation, and deceit. The public outcry was swift, but it wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about the system he had created, the toxic culture he had fostered, the lives he had ruined, and the people he had used as stepping stones for his own success. As the investigation continued, more and more names surfaced, people who had been complicit in his schemes, covering up his actions for years. And for the first time, I felt the weight of everything I had been through begin to lift. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. But even as I watched the fallout from the sidelines, a part of me couldn't help but feel a gnawing emptiness. I had won, yes. But in doing so, I had lost something too. The company I had dedicated myself to for so long, 15 years, was gone. The people I had trusted, those who had been my friends, my colleagues, were now scattered like pieces of a broken puzzle. Some of them were still loyal to Thomas, too afraid to speak out, while others had jumped ship, eager to distance themselves from the mess. The friendships I had built over the years felt hollow now, the connections strained by the revelations that had come to light. Sandra had been there through it all. When the dust settled, she was the first person I reached out to. We had both been through the same storm, but in different ways. She had warned me from the beginning, but even she hadn't anticipated just how far Thomas's reach had extended. The aftermath of his exposure had left her shaken, but not broken. I knew she had been through as much as I had, maybe even more, but her resolve was stronger than ever. "I didn't think I'd ever see this day," Sandra said when we finally spoke in person after the storm had passed. I didn't think we'd actually do it. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Neither did I. But here we are. And I guess the world keeps turning. She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. I still don't know what comes next for any of us. The company's in shambles, and people like us, well, we don't just fit back in after something like this. She was right. The company was a shadow of what it had once been. The culture had been irrevocably damaged, and even if new leadership was put in place, it would take years to rebuild the trust that had been destroyed. But the truth was, I didn't care about the company anymore. It was no longer my home. The people who remained, those who had turned a blind eye to everything that had been happening, weren't the ones I wanted to be around. Maybe it's time to move on, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. I've been stuck in that world for so long, Sandra. Maybe it's time to finally step away. Sandra didn't argue. She just nodded. She had always been the pragmatic one, the one who saw the bigger picture even when I was too focused on the details. We both need something new, something that isn't tied to the past. It's time for us to find our own way. It was strange, letting go of something I had worked so hard for. But as I looked at Sandra, I realized that there was something bigger at play here than just the company. This wasn't just about Thomas or his fall from grace. It was about the journey we had been on, about how far we had come, and about what we still had left to build. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty, but also a sense of liberation. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. I didn't have to live in the shadows of corporate greed anymore. I didn't have to keep playing the game. It was time for something new, something honest. Sandra and I stayed in touch, supporting each other as we navigated the strange, unfamiliar territory of life after the corporate world. The company might have been a part of my past, but it was no longer my future. The world was wide open now, and I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. As for Thomas, he disappeared into the background, his name tarnished and his reputation shattered. The people who had once followed him were left to pick up the pieces, but it was too late for him. He had been exposed for what he truly was, nothing more than a man with power, wielding it ruthlessly until he was no longer needed. In the end, that was his downfall. He had underestimated the very people he had tried to control, and in the end, they had taken him down, piece by piece. I sat by the window one evening, looking out at the city skyline. It felt different now, not just because of everything that had happened, but because I knew that the world had changed. I had changed. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The past was behind me, and the future, for better or for worse, was mine to shape. What had started as a battle for survival had turned into a battle for something more, freedom. And now, it was mine. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle into something I could finally comprehend. The noise, the chaos, the anger. Everything was beginning to fade into a distant memory, leaving behind the quiet space for reflection. I sat alone in my apartment one evening, the soft hum of the city outside reminding me that the world kept moving, indifferent to the battles we fought in its shadows. What did it all mean, I wondered? Was this victory? Or was it just the end of something that had been broken beyond repair long before I'd even noticed? I had won. I had exposed the truth, taken down the man who had controlled so much of my life for years. But in doing so, I had lost everything I had worked for. The company, the relationships, the identity I had spent so long crafting, all of it was gone. And yet, as I sat there, a strange feeling washed over me. A sense of peace, perhaps. For the first time in years, I wasn't trapped. The fear that had haunted me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that I was free. Free from the corporate games, free from the manipulations, free from the need to prove my worth. Maybe that was the real victory. I picked up my phone and dialed Sandra's number, the familiar ring offering a small comfort. She picked up after a few moments, her voice warm but still carrying that underlying exhaustion from the storm we'd weathered together. "Hey," I said, a smile tugging at my lips. "You know, I think I'm finally starting to understand what comes next." Sandra chuckled softly. "Yeah, me too. I think we've both earned a little bit of peace, don't you think?" I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of her words. Peace. It was something I hadn't known in years, but now I had it. It wasn't the resolution I had imagined, but maybe it was the one I needed. The road ahead was uncertain, full of unknowns, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it. We all have our battles to fight, and some of us will emerge from them stronger, wiser, and with scars that will forever remind us of the fight. But the real strength comes not from winning, it comes from the ability to walk away and leave the past behind. And so, with no plans, no guarantees, and no promises, I took my first step toward whatever was waiting for me next. The future was unwritten, but for the first time, I was excited to write it.